Welcome to our podcast. We're so excited to have you along for this journey. My name is Madison, and I'm the Executive Director of Peace Restored. I will be your host as we discuss mental health and faith in our podcast, Seeking Healing, Finding Hope, which is a production of Peace Restored, a 501c3 nonprofit located in Indiana and serving women everywhere. We're so glad to have you listening in again this week. On our podcast this week, I have joining me Rebekah Gilmore, who is our class facilitator and clinical intern. I'm excited to have Becca join me as we continue to discuss boundaries. Last time on our podcast, you were able to hear Renee discuss with us the symptoms and responses from boundaries or lack of boundaries. Today, we'll be delving a little bit deeper into the conversation on boundaries. Before we start with Becca, I want to remind you and everyone listening to check out our show notes to find links and other resources mentioned during today's podcast. Welcome, Becca.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back on. I think it'll be a good conversation today, delving into a little bit deeper into the boundaries topic.
Yes.
And you've had the opportunity over the last, several months where you've been doing a group here at the office working on the topic of boundaries.
Yes, it's been fantastic just being able to lead a group with women and just to learn more about boundaries and how to say no kindly and just really learning everything through that as I can as well.
Yeah. I'm sure, like you said, it has been learning curve for you as well as it has been watching the women and engaging with them during that process.
Yeah, it's been an interesting experience for sure.
Yeah, because this is the second group that you've led. And so each group's been a little different and a little bit different dynamic of the women that have been there. But it's, and I've had opportunity to sit in a couple of them, haven't been in very many. But yeah, so it's been good to have that engagement and with the different women. Because this is such a needed topic and it's such a valuable topic. I don't think it's one that I knew much about in my younger years. And boy, I wish I would have been able to know what a boundary was and how to set them and how to hold them. Because I know for myself personally, that's what caused a lot of my issues in relationships.
Yeah.
And you know, because I quite frankly just didn't even, I don't think I ever heard the word boundary. I don't know about you.
I didn't. Growing up, I never really heard that term either, and it wasn't until maybe a few years ago or within the last 5 years that it really came to my mind too, and I started to learn more about it, and it's just so eye-opening to just see how you can apply that in every relationship that you have.
Yeah, because sometimes I think we think of the word boundaries in relationship to like an intimate or a partner relationship, but it's not just that marital or partnership relationship. It is, like you said, every relationship you're in, whether it's your children, your friends, your coworkers, whatever it may be. We have to have good boundaries because if not, it can cause a lot of conflict, as we've been learning over the last several weeks.
Yeah, and you can lose out on those relationships that could have potentially been really good, healthy ones.
Yeah. And sometimes it causes unnecessary pain in that relationship, and because there's just not that clear communication.
Yeah.
Yeah. So last week with Renee, or not last week, but in our last podcast on boundaries with Renee, we talked a lot about some of those symptoms that, like those physical symptoms we might have from boundaries, from that lack of boundaries, really. You know, so I think sometimes when we think of boundaries and so maybe even think of some of those physical symptoms, we might associate with them with something else. But often, like, you know, I think some of the ones that we talked about were that feeling overwhelmed or the anxiety and provoking thoughts or sometimes even depressive episodes. I'm not saying that all depression is a boundary issue, but sometimes that might be part of it.
Yeah. If I remember too, it's usually a feeling prompts. It's like a warning sign that something is wrong.
Yeah.
And so then that's where you can start to examine, I guess, where your boundaries or lack of boundaries are.
Yeah. Right. So they're really good indicators for us to be able to say, okay, when we feel those symptoms, it's a way for us to kind of take pause and go, okay, what do I need to evaluate and look at, and how can I make those necessary adjustments?
Yeah.
That's really good. So boundaries also give us the opportunity to take ownership. I'm distinguishing what's mine and what's the other person's, because again, I think if we don't know that, just like and you brought your example of the yard, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but being able to see what that distinctive line is for ourselves is important, because if not, those kind of get enmeshed and tangled up.
Yeah, and if you're not able to have that clear understanding of where your boundary lies, how can you take ownership of it?
Yeah. It's kind of like what we said, I think, in the first podcast. It's like if we don't know what our physical property line is, it's really hard to know where what part of our yard is for us to take care of. So if we think of our emotional boundaries in the same dynamic as the property lines and on a physical property, it helps us to make that correlation of, okay, if I don't know where my yard begins and ends, how do I know what I take care of? Because we could inadvertently be taking care of our neighbor's yard. But once we know where that fence is or that property line is, then we can clearly determine what we need to be caring for. Yeah. So it's really important for us to kind of know that line. So today we're going to kind of pivot, though, and start talking about laws of boundaries. Yeah. So the first law that we have in boundaries is the law of sowing and reaping. Why don't you spend a little bit of time talking about that and explain it to everybody what that law is?
Yeah, so the law of sowing and reaping, basically when you set a boundary, or let's say the law is interrupted when somebody else ends up pretty much taking responsibility for what the other person is sowing. So I guess the wrong person ends up reaping what somebody else sows.
Okay.
Yeah.
So an example of that might be like when a mom that deposits money into her kid's account or children's account, every time they overdraft. So like, I have to help take care of them. I'm protecting them. I'm caring for them. And while maybe the first time that might be true, but if you do that habitually.
Yeah, it enables the behavior to continue, right?
Yeah. So we're not allowing them to reap and to sow
properly, yeah.
Right. So we're mitigating that. We're keeping it from happening.
Yeah, and it's hard because it can be an instinct to want to take, especially if you're a mother, you want to take care of your child, right? And you just lose track of you accidentally enable that behavior, right?
Yeah, because it does feel natural almost, especially I think for a parent to want to go in and to care for their children, and that's really normal for us to do as they're young, maybe in those toddler ages or elementary age. Of course, we need to protect them and intervene. But at a certain point, that has to start shifting, allowing them to feel their consequences of their choices. Because if we don't, they're not going to change their behavior. So as we're continuing the conversation of thinking about sowing and reaping, it's really important to know how to set those boundaries well. Because if we don't do that, just like we were saying, that boundaries keep the person from being able to reap or to feel the consequences of what they do. So it's that. So when we think of sowing and reaping, another word for reaping is kind of like consequences. And again, consequences are both positive and negative. So whatever we sow, whatever we do. So another word for sow would be do. So whatever we do is going to equate or cause a consequence or the reaping of that.
Yeah, and so if somebody never feels the weight of those decisions and never feels the consequence, they're not experiencing any pain. If they're not experiencing pain, then they have no real motivation or interest in changing a behavior. And then they just stay in that same pattern.
Yeah. Yeah. So it can be detrimental if we stay in a negative pattern for that to continue to happen.
Yeah, so kind of what I was just saying, if you try to confront somebody and their behavior, confronting really isn't going to be the thing that wakes them up and makes them want to change. It's just going to be words thrown at them, and they might want to challenge the confrontation. So really, consequences are the only thing that will make them change, because they need to be able to feel that pain and maybe that loss of the, how would you word that? Just loss of the experience that they're going through in their own world. So they definitely just need to feel the consequences for them to change.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning of this, talking of the sowing and reaping. If we don't allow someone to feel the consequences, if we don't allow them to feel the cause of their behavior, then they're not going to make the change.
No.
I think I always like to, I don't know, maybe it's I think thinking about food is very relatable for most people, so I always like to use it as an example. Mm-hmm. So I think like if you woke up every day and you ate a whole cake, and you didn't gain any weight and you had no negative effects to it, we'd probably, I don't know, eat cake every day.
Yeah.
But the reason why people limit their cake intake and their sugar intake and all that, because it's a negative effect on our health.
Yeah.
Has a negative effect on your weight. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you ate a whole cake every day, well.
And so that actually makes me think about most people, too, when they're younger, they don't have the side effects of eating so much cake.
This is true.
Until they get older, their metabolism slows, and then out of nowhere, they gain all this weight, metaphorically, right?
Yeah.
And they're kind of so shocked, and they have to do all these crazy things to get back on track. And so I think a lot of people can relate in the sense that we were saying we didn't even hear really the word boundary until you're older, right?
Yeah.
To even learn about it. And so I imagine in the law of reaping and sowing, if they don't reap any consequences until they're much older, and how hard that could be.
Yeah, you're right. That would be so hard to shift. Because like you said, when you're a kid, if you're given full permission to eat all the cake every day, and then suddenly you become an adult, and it's like, oh, you start to feel.
Yeah, and you're like, I wish somebody would have taught me this earlier.
Like, what? And it might even be, and it's not going to be as obvious, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be because you've been eating cake now for, a long time.
20 years or something.
Right. And you're like, you're trying to figure out, well, why do I feel so bad? What's going on?
Mm-hmm. It can be very confusing.
Yeah, it can. And so while we're using cake as an example, right, we can replace the word cake with lack of boundaries, right?
Yeah.
And so when we do behaviors that has been consistent for a long time, and then we're trying to figure out, like, what's going on, until we learn that it's a boundary issue, it can be really confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the next law that we're going to talk about is the law of responsibility. Responsibility. It's an important word when we tie it up with boundaries.
Yeah. I'm like taking responsibility for other people's actions. And some of the reasons that people tend to take responsibility for others, they might be fearful of being seen as being selfish.
Yeah.
Like, how dare you? We're supposed to deny ourselves. You might have been taught that growing up.
Yeah. Especially if you come from a family of faith or a faith origin. And that's a typical, that's a very normative thing that we hear is we need to deny ourselves. And we're not saying that the scripture's not correct and saying that we need to think of others, but there's a differentiation between denying ourselves without boundaries.
Yeah.
Yeah, there has to be a limit to everything.
Yeah, we should be able to take responsibility for ourselves. And by doing that, it looks like setting limits that are actually healthy for us. But instead, you fear other people and their perception of you and them thinking that you're just thinking about yourself.
Yeah. What if?
Yeah.
Like, they might think I'm fill in the blank, right?
Yeah.
They might not think I'm caring of others.
Yeah, they might not want to be my friend if I set this boundary. A lot of reasons to hold back from it.
Yeah, they might think that I'm not a good person. Yeah, so there's a lot of fear that can come up.
Anytime that you end up taking responsibility for somebody else, that can be easy to do. But what this does is you're creating infants or somebody, you're holding them back from maturing.
You're keeping them at that infancy stage almost, right? So, like, we're not saying that you are still
literally
as an age
baby.
a baby, right? We're saying that in your emotional state, you're not being able to grow, be able to mature.
Yeah.
You're not going to have that emotional intelligence, if you will, that you should have when you're allowed to practice boundaries well.
Yeah. And I think of that too, like if having that realization helped me, I know, because it's actually doing a healthy and loving thing to set those boundaries because you're allowing them to mature and have that opportunity. And if you set those or if you take responsibility for them all the time, you're taking away that opportunity from them.
Yeah. Yeah, because it can be uncomfortable
Yeah.
to be in a place where you're setting a boundary and the other person, maybe boundaries is new for them as well. And they may give you some pushback.
Yeah.
And they may not appreciate the responsibility that's being maybe pushed upon them in a good way. And that can cause some friction in that relationship.
Yeah. But I also do feel like in the long run that they would thank you for it.
Yeah. If it's a healthy relationship, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that I'm thinking about as we're talking about this. Because many of the times the women that we work with, when they come to us, they're not in that dynamic where they have a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
So it can be very scary to learn to set boundaries. If you've been in a space where you haven't had that freedom or permission to be able to set boundaries, and so if you try to set a boundary or to require the other person to accept their responsibility, sometimes there's been a negative consequence.
Which reinforces their fear, right? Mm-hmm. And something to cling to, this is a reason why it didn't work out last time. Why should I try again?
Yeah, especially if there's been any abuse that's been tied into that, trying to set boundaries, or when you're working on setting your boundaries and there's maybe been an abusive response, that makes it really hard. So if that's your dynamic that you're in and you're listening to this, and like, I've tried to set these boundaries that you're talking about, but every time I do, I get hurt. Whether it's physically hurt, emotionally, mentally, whatever that hurt is, please reach out for help. Don't stay in that space where you feel alone, because there are resources out there for you. You can call our office. You can it doesn't matter. Just find somebody to lean into. Don't stay in that space alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I wanted to kind of talk about that little differentiation, because I think we're talking about how to set boundaries, and that's something that's difficult enough to do if you haven't had that practice. Even if you're in a healthy relationship dynamic, when two people are willing to learn together, that's still so challenging. But then when you're in that dynamic where it's not healthy,
especially if you don't have support on the outside of that relationship.
Yeah. So it's so important to reach out. Hopefully you'll be encouraged by this podcast to know that there are places that want to support you. There are people that want to support you to help you reach out. So hopefully you can differentiate between those two lenses as we're talking about this. But I think it continues to go back in this conversation as we're talking about that responsibility. I'm reminded of when, again, at the beginning of the Boundaries book, it talks about the differentiation between responsibility to and responsibility for.
Yeah.
And what we're responsible for versus what we're responsible to.
Yeah.
And so
what that means is being responsible to is coming alongside those people that are carrying excess burdens, that are really struggling, and we want to come alongside them and support them. And so then being responsible for your own feelings, actions, and behaviors. And then also the other person on the other side of that, them being responsible for their own feelings, behaviors, and actions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because if someone feels uncomfortable, they're upset, it doesn't mean it's your job as the person who set that limit or boundary to fix their feelings. Now, we can be with them. We can sit in that space with them and hear them.
Yeah.
But we don't have to be the repair of that unless we've caused harm. Or this is all making the assumption that you're just setting a boundary. You're saying, hey, I can't do this with you. And sometimes when we say I can't or I'm unable to for whatever reason, the other person hearing that information, it's hard for them. And it can feel heavy.
They could feel rejected or not loved themselves.
Yeah.
They might have a different idea of what love looks like or an expectation on you. I don't know. I think it's important or helpful to say statements like, I love you, but this is not good for me.
Yeah.
And we can go through this together, but...
Yeah, because sometimes, and we all have different needs and different ways that is important for us as we grow and we mature, and just to help us to stay healthy. So like for myself, for example, I am a very introverted person by nature, and one of the ways that I recover, or I need to every once in a while, is just to kind of block everybody out. And it's not because, and that can feel very off-putting or rejecting. Like when I set that limit, say, if I need to take space away from you or whoever that you is, right, from just people in general, to the people that I might say that to, or I might separate from, it could feel, like you said, rejecting, like, I don't want to be around you, I don't like you. And it's not about that. It's just I've learned that for myself, I need to have that limit of how much interaction I can have, because at some point I need that separateness so I can regenerate, recuperate, do all the things that I need to do to take care of myself, that good self-care.
Yeah, and then if you do that, you're able to give love appropriately and out of the fullness of your heart, rather than pushing yourself to a limit and not giving in the best way that you could.
Yeah, because I think of my younger years when I would feel that need to pull away, to kind of be refreshed by myself, I'd have this tremendous guilt. Like, I felt like I was feeling I was bad.
Yeah.
Because I just couldn't be present with everybody.
All the time.
Yeah, all the time. Like, and I would put this heavy weight on myself, and I'd be like, why can't I do all the things that I should do?
Yeah.
And instead of giving myself permission to be able to set the boundary or limit of, I'm just a human. I can only do this many things, and that's okay. Yeah. And sometimes I need to take a break and be alone, and that's okay too. But it took me years to be okay with that, and then learn how to say that to other people was really hard too. And I think that's probably, maybe that's not everybody's story is just like mine, right? But I'm sure there's those things that we all hold on to that go, oh, I couldn't say that to somebody. I couldn't set that limit or that boundary because I'm going to feel bad, because they're going to feel like I don't want them or I don't care about them. And when they feel those feelings, like we're talking about, is we have to each be responsible for our own feelings. And so we have to allow them to feel that. That doesn't mean we reject them or don't sit in that space. We just say, hey, I love you and I want to be here for you. But to be my best self, this is what I need to be able to do.
Yeah, it sounds like, too, what we were talking about earlier. You go back to feeling that guilt and feeling selfish for taking that time away for yourself.
Absolutely.
When really it's just the healthiest thing for you.
Because God did not design us to be constantly going, constantly producing, constantly taking care of anybody.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes in our culture today, we get that unspoken message that it isn't healthy to take a break, or healthy to not be busy. I think in our American or Western culture, it's very normative to continue forward or continue to be busy.
Yeah, it's unacceptable to take a break or be tired. You should just be Wonder Woman and never sleep.
Right. Yeah. And so it's okay for us to learn to set those limits regardless of what that is in our culture.
Yeah.
Because our culture does a lot of times dictate to us our boundaries. And that's why we have to really know what our boundaries are, because if we don't, somebody else is going to set them for us.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the next law that we want to talk about is the law of power and powerlessness. So when you think of that law, what are some things that kind of come to mind for you, Becca?
Well, I think about the fact that we cannot change anyone else, but we can change ourselves with God's help. I think it's important to know, too, you do need the help of God to kind of reach into your life and show the areas and reveal the boundaries that you're supposed to have. I think that it's also important to think about what you do have power over. And some of those things are being able to agree with the truth about your problems and to admit that. Yeah.
As we're talking about power and powerlessness, again, just because we work a lot in the trauma and the abuse world, and so it comes to mind, that power dynamic that comes up in the abuse cycle, and so this might be a really challenging spot.
Yeah.
For someone who is coming out of abuse or maybe has experienced abuse. Keep in mind, this doesn't mean that it's a current maybe experience. It could be something that maybe it was a dynamic you were brought up in as a child, and you still have some of those narratives in your mind.
Of feeling powerless.
And so this can be a really challenging law of boundaries for somebody that's been in that dynamic.
Yeah.
So we have to, like you were saying, we have to know what we have power over and what we don't have power over. We have to be able to differentiate between those things, but I think we also have to recognize in that space is that other people don't get to have that power over us.
Yeah. To realize that you deserve the right to have the power over yourself and to set those boundaries.
Yeah.
And that's a healthy thing for you to do.
So as we continue to kind of delve into this idea of the law of power and powerlessness, we really want to be thinking about what we do have power over. Because there's a lot of things that we've kind of wrestled through a little bit of the idea of power and powerlessness. But there's things that we do have power over, and I think when I think of the word power, I also think of control, the things that we have control over.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that you have noticed or that you recognize that we do have power or control over?
Yeah, so I think that something you do have control over is just submitting your inability to God, things that you're not perfect in, things that you know you struggle with, and you can give those things to God.
So it's like we have to recognize, what I'm hearing is we need to be able to recognize our own weakness.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when we recognize our own weakness or where we don't have all the abilities to do things, we might bristle against that. Like, I don't want to say I'm weak.
Yeah, it can feel like a bad thing.
Yeah.
Well, also another thing I think culture sometimes can tell you, like, to hide those things and that you can't show that.
For sure.
And you have to put up that facade of being perfect sometimes and successful.
Yeah.
But I think it's successful to realize those weaknesses and it's strength to give them to God.
Absolutely, because it is an impossible expectation to say that we can be able to do all the things all the time perfectly. And sometimes that's an expectation that we do put on ourselves, but so by being able to kind of confess or acknowledge our areas of weakness really is a way to release some of that tension internally.
Yeah, and it can be very humbling as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So then the more that we're able to go through that process of recognizing what we do have power or control over, it does really change the dynamic of how we think and how we interact with others. It allows us to be able to maybe ask for help or reach out and talk to other people when there's been some injuries that's happened to us, whether it's been maybe through our own developmental stages, whether emotionally or relationally or whatever that's been.
Childhood baggage or anything like that.
Yes, sometimes it's when we get to that place, we're able to do that and be able to walk through some of that difficulty. We might even be able to make amends or to work out past hurts with others. Yeah,
that you've caused to hurt somebody else's feelings that resulted in damaging a good relationship. You can reach out to those people.
And it might even be the other way, too, is maybe somebody's caused a hurt to you.
Yeah.
And now you're able to not feel that powerlessness and be able to go and say, hey, this is what's happened. And you can just take it over to them. It doesn't mean that they're going to suddenly maybe want to fix or repair.
Yeah.
But by being able to do that, you're able to go and release that part and set that limitation, that boundary of this is how far I can go with you now.
Yeah, because that's something that you can control, right?
Yeah.
You can take responsibility of your own actions by going to that person and bringing those hurt feelings to them.
Yeah. So sometimes it's about submitting to the process and submitting and being able to go through all these steps. And it's not easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one prayer that stands out to me regarding that is the serenity prayer. It's pretty much what this law is talking about. It says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things you cannot change, the courage to change the things you can, and then the wisdom to know the difference.
That's such a good prayer for us to remember, because it does help us to remember that it's not all about, we don't get to control everything, and sometimes we have to release what we can't control over to God
and how
trust
relieving.
Him. Yeah, because part of that's that trust.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that we remember that we can't change others. We can change, but we only get the ability to change ourselves. We get to work on our own destructive or negative patterns of behavior.
Yeah.
That's our responsibility, not others' responsibility. Just like their behaviors and their patterns aren't our responsibility to fix.
Yeah.
We get to let them know that we don't appreciate or value, but it's not our job to make them change.
And by changing yourself, that would then cause the other person to maybe notice that and want to change themselves, or they might realize that their own destructive patterns aren't working on you anymore. And they're like, oh, wait, hold up. And then they'll then change.
Yeah. So that's the objective, right? Is that, again, in that healthy relationship dynamic, is that the other individual is going to recognize, like, wait a minute, I'm not getting the same response I've always gotten in the past. Like if I was to use some type of pressure to get them to do whatever I need them to do, no longer are you just complying to that pressure.
Yeah.
You're saying, like, listen, that's not that's past my limit. You know, you may want me to stay up and have dinner with you at 10 o'clock at night, but I need to be in bed by 9.
And then that presents them with a choice, right? What are they going to choose for their behavior next?
Yeah. Right.
Can reveal to how healthy of a relationship it is to begin with. Is it one that they're going to stick around for you?
Yeah. Yeah. So by allowing them to feel the consequence, as we talked about in the last, earlier today, is it allows them to start to make maybe new decisions of, do I want to stay in this relationship? Do I want to do better? Do I want to change how I'm responding?
Yeah.
Because if they're not feeling that weight, they're never going to think about doing things differently.
And it gives them that opportunity to mature and grow themselves.
Yeah.
And that's a very loving thing, I think, to do.
Absolutely. I think we forget that.
Yeah.
That by allowing someone to feel the consequences, it's the opportunity for growth.
Yeah.
And by giving someone the opportunity of growth, we're loving them well.
Yes.
Yeah.
It just can be hard. It can feel like you're afraid of hurting somebody you love.
Yeah.
Well,
I think if we go back to the example at the very beginning was with the adult child that continues to overdraw their account. And we feel love. It feels loving to continue to go like, oh, I'll just put $100 in their account. And then 2 weeks later, you put another $100 in the account. It feels very loving, like I'm caring for my child really well.
Until that person is in their 50s later on and then can't respect anybody's boundaries.
Right.
They're an adult child.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
They're an adult 50-year-old child, right? Still relying on their parents or their friends.
Yeah. To just bail them out of any hard circumstance.
Right. Like, it becomes the expectation of what culture will do for you instead of learning how to manage that on your own. So, it's so important. Boundaries, as we keep talking about, there's so many things that we can learn from that. Well, that leads us into the next law, which is the law of respect. So this is one that I think we talk a lot about in boundaries because law of respect correlates directly with the word no.
Yeah. And so learning how to respect somebody else's no. And then if you can do that, then you'll also expect them to respect yours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. And so hearing no, accepting no, it's so important. I think also when we think of the word no, I think it comes off as a negative word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and when it's really not.
Yeah. Right. Because no doesn't have to be negative. I mean, just because no actually can be kind.
Yeah.
Because when you say yes to something that you really mean no to, there's a weightiness that comes to that.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess if you're listening to this, I just challenge you to think about, was there a time, and I'm going to guess most people can say yes, that you had a time that you wanted to say no, but you didn't feel permission to say it? So you just said yes anyways, and then all of a sudden you had like this, probably felt like an elephant sitting on your chest.
Yeah.
Or like the weight of the world you were carrying around. It was like, how am I going to do this?
Yeah, and over time that creates resentment.
Yes.
For the situation.
Yeah. I remember in something I was reading, preparing for one of the Boundaries podcast or classes on demand that we've been doing. There was a statement that I read that stuck with me, is that when you're not able to say no or hear no, it's like adding Miracle Grow to the relationship. It's like adding Miracle Grow to the resentment in the relationship.
Oh.
And I thought, that is, that's a pretty big statement to think about. Like if we don't know how to set those boundaries well, and we don't know how to accept them and receive them, it's like taking that Miracle Grow and just kind of sprinkling it on every time.
Yeah.
And that resentment just grows and grows and grows quickly.
Rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So being able to say no and accept no is so important. But it goes back again, we were talking about that fear component. There's a lot of fear that comes up from other people because maybe they don't want to respect our boundaries, or there's a compliance issue. Then, like you talked about, the resentments, there's a lot that kind of circles around just saying no. Because I think it goes back to we believe it to be negative.
Yeah, and that fear of their reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just easier to comply in the moment.
Yeah.
Without realizing where that Miracle Grow comes in along with it, without realizing it.
Yeah. Because, I think when we practice that dynamic of not saying no, not accepting no, just complying, all those things, right? And we've put that Miracle Grow on that resentment over the years, it almost feels like it's like suddenly our relationship is in this place. And like and I've seen this before in relationship where they're just like, I don't know how I got here.
Mm-hmm. And it just gets so big.
Yeah.
Out of nowhere and then topples over.
Yeah, because it's like they can remember back when they first were in that relationship, like we were really good together, we were really good friends, we were really good, partners, whatever that might be. But now suddenly, it feels we're in this place of chaos.
Yeah.
And it can happen pretty quickly because it's that resentment just grows. And resentment is so dangerous to a relationship.
Yeah.
So then that brings us to the last law that we're going to talk about today, which is the law of motivation.
Mm-hmm.
So the law of motivation. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that law of motivation and how that applies to boundaries?
Yeah. So what we really should ask ourselves is, what is the motive behind the boundaries you set, or just behind what you're giving to other people?
So what's the motive behind the boundary?
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes can those motives not be
positive
or genuine?
Yes.
Yeah, they might be not very good. Maybe false motives behind them.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some fear that's associated to our motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about fear a lot today, because I think a lot of fear, as we think through this, is associated with boundaries, right? So,
absolutely.
Yeah. I have to do this because if I don't do this thing, they might.
Yeah, so when you say yes, but you really want to say no, can stem from you being afraid of that person leaving you, fear of abandonment.
Yeah.
And then if that person leaves you, you'll be alone, so you're going to be afraid of loneliness.
Yeah. And those are heavy feelings for some, especially, if you were brought up in a childhood where that was your experience, where you were abandoned, whether directly or indirectly by somebody, or left alone, and then it can make it really difficult to set those boundaries because what if?
You don't want to relive that again.
Right.
So you comply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't, because our childhood pain that we've been through can sometimes be our worst fears relived as an adult.
Yeah. It's hard too. You think you maybe moved on past that trauma, and then it can come back up in a relationship later on, kind of can sneak its way in there.
Yeah. And this isn't to say that all parents are bad parents, but sometimes inadvertently things happen or events and they translate in our minds to be like, oh, I wasn't cared for, or I wasn't valued, or I was abandoned. And it could just be there was a couple experiences that made you feel abandoned. It may not have been your whole life.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of ways that can kind of come out in you. And so knowing that is important as you're kind of setting these boundaries and recognizing the fears that can come up.
Yeah.
There might also be a fear of losing maybe kind of what's good or who I truly am on the inside.
Yeah, especially if you grew up in that, faith-based environment, and there's that expectation for you to look a certain way and seem a certain way.
Yeah.
And if you're afraid of not seeming like a good person anymore, if you set a boundary.
Yeah, so it's like that, again, that idea of compliance versus really working on who you are as a person. I just need to comply, because if I comply, then I will be good enough.
Yeah, and then that's not separating you from the other person.
And it's not biblical.
No.
It's not. Sometimes it's what's been taught, but it doesn't make it true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some other things that we might think of in relationship to the law of motivation is there might be some guilt that comes up, or maybe your motivation might be tied to not just guilt, but maybe wanting to get that person to kind of pay back, or kind of a I got you kind of thing.
Yeah,
is what I think of.
If they got you first and made you feel bad, you might want to make them feel bad. Another one is an over-identification of feeling somebody else's loss or pain. And so what that means is you're afraid of putting on somebody else or having them experience pain that you've felt in the past, and it just feels so heavy to give somebody a no or set a boundary, because you'll then feel the pain they feel from it. Yeah. And you're afraid of their pain.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, as we're talking through this, a lot of this is going back to fear.
Yeah.
I mean, so much fear can be a director, can really lead us.
Yeah.
And we have to be really careful to not let that fear control us and guide us, because it can take us into some places that's not what's best for us. And so as we're talking through this, we can really see how fear can be the leader.
It's really braided into everything, it seems like, doesn't it?
Yeah. And we don't want fear to be our leader.
No.
Yeah. Because if it does, it doesn't always play out the best.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, as we're talking through this, it takes me back to if you've been in a situation that is either actively or in your recent history been abusive, that fear component can be really heavy.
Yeah.
You're like, I have to comply. I have to do this. I have to, because if not, the consequence has been so heavy for you, that fear can really be heavy.
Yeah. And so then if you're letting fear control you in that way, you're not living in freedom, which is how we should be living. And if you don't have that freedom first, how can you fully give service to other people out of the love of your heart?
Yeah, so it can be really hard.
Yeah.
To know how to set that separateness, If you've been in a situation that's been traumatic or abusive or just really challenging for you to overcome, again, we just encourage you to reach out and find somebody to help you process through that so you can get to these places where you can serve others and care for others, and to not allow your fear to lead you, and to get yourself into a safe place to where you can practice boundaries safely. Because if you are in an active abusive situation, boundaries may not be your first thing that you want to step into right now. And so we just encourage you to reach out for help and to make sure that you get to a place or to find someone that can help you through this, because safety planning is your first priority right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So today we've talked about quite a few of the different laws. We've talked about the law of motivation, law of respect. We've also talked a little bit about power and powerlessness. What were the...
Sowing and reaping. And law of responsibility.
Yeah. So there's quite a few laws that we talked through today. And, if you haven't read Dr. Cloud & Townsend's book, Boundaries, I would encourage you to get the book and read it. We'll make sure to post that in the show notes so you can easily link to it and find the book, because it is such a good resource. We use it here in our office as a resource with our clients, not just in the groups that Becca leads, but also with one-on-ones with our clients as well, because we know that boundaries are so vitally important and such a valuable tool for us to put in our toolbox as we're continuing to grow and to mature in our own walk. Yeah. Any other thoughts as we wrap up today about boundaries as you're thinking about, because I know you have a lot of wisdom from the boundary world, because you just, that's where you've been for the last several months working on boundaries. So even if it's not about something that we've talked about today in the laws, what's one of the things that's really hangs with you or you think about often when you think about boundaries?
I don't know, I guess when I think about boundaries too, I think how it's scary to step out of your comfort zone and set that first boundary if you haven't ever done it before, if this is new to you. I just want to encourage you, if that's where you are, that in doing so and taking that risk, it's just very empowering, and I just can't stress enough how it works.
Yeah. I love that word, empowering, because again, if you've been in a place where you just have felt powerless, to be able to help someone to feel that they can make choices, they do have autonomy, it's amazing to do that and to understand that about yourself. So it's been a good conversation today, talking about boundaries and the first 5 of the laws. And we have 5 more that we're going to go into, which we'll do on the next podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad you've been here. Thank you for spending time with us talking about this topic. And we appreciate everybody who's joined us today on listening to us on Seeking Healing, Finding Hope. If you have missed any of our previous podcasts, we would ask that you would check them out. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn more about us, go to our website, peacerestore.net, and don't forget to check out our show notes. You'll be able to find the links to our website and additional content, and maybe even a few additional video links as well. We're working on an exciting project, which we talked about in the last podcast, and which we'll release in a few months, which will be our classes on demand. This will be an option to learn more and to dive deeper into your healing journey, all from the comfort of your home. They're a little different if you're not familiar with classes on demand from podcast, but you'll get to get even more content than what you get, and we're going to go a little bit deeper on the topic. Boundaries will be the first one we jump into. So make sure to watch for the announcement of the release date of the classes on demand as we begin to wrap up our discussion today. Make sure to stay tuned as we begin to share with you practical ways where you too can seek healing and find hope. Join us on our next podcast, where we will continue to discuss mental health and faith. So come back next time for transformation, growth, and power. This is Peace Restored.